Well, good afternoon. Welcome to your story. Really, I just want to say from the Center for Study of Working Class Life, what we're trying to do in the Center for Study of Working Class Life is to bring class into focus in its operations to shape people's lives and experiences here in the United States, which can't be done without understanding the intersection of class with race and with gender, and the operation of class in the United States with its operation worldwide, its global economic system we're in. Now, the way that we are trying to do this and why we sponsored and co-sponsored this study, this conference, and this session in particular, is because we want to encourage people to ground their scholarship in the lived experience of class. And we want the practitioners and the people who are in the field to do more than tell war stories, but to really think about what those war stories and what that war is, and how do we understand what lessons there are in those interactions in the world that help us to understand how class works, and how class works in its intersection with race and gender. So the thing that's so important to us in the center, and I think to the organizers of this conference about this session, in this conference, is that we are trying to integrate theory and practice, walk on those two legs of intellectual work, but also grounded experience in really trying to change the world. And I think we have a panel here that can talk on both of those aspects, in both of those levels. And that's what we're looking forward to, and that's what our work is, and that's what we would encourage everybody sitting in the room to do with their work and with their lives, whether it's in the field or whether it's in the research library or in the classroom. And that's my wish for today, and we'll just keep on with the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Everybody hear me?
Turn off the cell phone.
Yes.
That's right. I want to give another round of applause for the opening remarks and for all the different departments and offices that were supportive of this endeavor. So many things to say. First of all, I want to give a shout out to my students who are here and who have obviously filled up the room, and all the students and other folks who are made it here for this event. I'm sure we have more than just Africana. We also have history students. We have everyone here. My name is Dr. Zebulon Miletsky. I am an assistant professor of Africana Studies, and more recently added to the history department as well as an affiliate member, which I am exceedingly proud of. Although Gary told me that not everyone has signed yet the form, so
I haven't signed. You got it.
So I hope this goes well. You know, I'm gonna have to sing for my supper on this one, but I am just really proud to be not only a member of Africana, but also affiliated with the history department, and to be part of this gathering. Just a quick story before we get going, and I don't want to cut into our time too much, but it's kind of interesting the way the universe works, I suppose you could say. I had a postdoctoral fellowship at Case Western Reserve University under the auspices of Rhonda Williams, who wrote an amazing book on women in public housing and has done work also on some of the areas that have been discussed today. And I found out that the person who had the fellowship before me was a gentleman by the name of Robert Chase. And I found certain archival material or artifacts, I believe they called. That was, yeah, a lot of Starbucks coffee. But right, but anyway, I mentioned that to say that, like many folk, I myself was educating myself on the carceral, what is being called the carceral state, learning about this thing called mass incarceration, as we have all, I think, had to do to some extent in the last several years, aside from our worthy colleagues and presenters today who have been laboring in the vineyards for much longer, working on this topic, which was not a glamorous topic, which was not a topic that was gaining as much attention as one might think in the early years. And it's just amazing to see that kind of work sort of, I guess, intersect with what's happening in the world right now, what's happening in our country. Had a chance to meet Heather Thompson, who was a frequent a visitor to Cleveland at that time and a friend of Rhonda's, and also meet by way of, at least by Facebook, Donna Murch and others. And in a sense, that year was kind of a crash course for me in terms of the carceral state of mass incarceration and this issue. And I learned quite a bit, hearing about Robert's work before me and hearing from folks who were doing this, made connections with other activists, one of whom at least is on this panel, who was already working on the issue. So that's how it began to come together for me. My research and the original work is looking at biracial identity and mixed race, and more recently looking at, I teach recent African American history here at Stony Brook, and I'm working on a manuscript about my hometown of Boston and the movement, the organic civil rights movement that was taking place and picking up steam before the busing crisis, which has kind of sucked all the attention away from, when people talk about Boston civil rights, they immediately talk about busing, and busing, or really we should say school desegregation, was certainly part of that. But there was a movement which dealt with issues that had nothing to do with education, housing, employment, jobs, and other issues. And so that's what I'm working on. So we continue the dialogue today, and I'm really pleased to introduce our panelists. We have assembled, I think, some of the folks who are working on or working in service of a lot of the issues that have been talked about today. We, I think, all have more information about the carceral state in a sense of the awesomeness of it or the overwhelming nature of it. Who are the people in the trenches that are fighting against it? I would submit to you that some of them are sitting right here with us, and I'm very proud to be able to introduce some of our speakers today. We've had some changes, and we had at least one person who could not be with us. But very quickly, you do have the bios in your program if you received the program, but I'll just start in the order that they are listed here. Charles Coleman, who is not here yet as well and may not be here. I'll probably let you read that one. Should he arrive, we hope he does. But Charles Coleman is a former assistant DA, Kings County, Brooklyn, turned civil litigator. He founded EDGE, Empower, Develop, Grow, Educate Movement NYC, which is an organization which promotes the mental, spiritual, physical, and overall well-being of young people in NYC and beyond. Coleman has been, last time I saw him, he was on TV at the Million Man March. So he's out there. He's been very active and very outspoken. And we will hope to welcome him. Malia Lazu is the co-founder and executive director. Say hi, Malia. Malia Lazu is the co-founder and executive director of Future Boston Alliance, an organization that combines business incubation and grassroots lobbying geared toward eliminating barriers to new entrepreneurs in Boston's traditionally underserved communities. Malia was a fellow at MIT's Community Innovators Lab, where her work focused on exploring the opportunities for deepening democratic practice among youth through the development of an experimental urban lab. Specifically, she worked on developing the urban lab by exploring effective models to reach urban youth using social media and networks to build communities and create critical citizens. Malia is also someone who's worked very closely with a stalwart who has really been sort of the guardian in terms of justice in Boston, named Mel King. Some of you may know that name. Mel King wrote a book called Chain of Change, which really stands up and has worked quite closely with him. We also are welcoming Dr. Jill Humphreys. Jill, yes. Scholar, activist, artist whose work focuses on advancing the human rights of Black and marginalized people globally. She is an instructor with the Africana Studies program at the University of Toledo. She's also one of 2 legal observers in the United States, recognized by the National Lawyers Guild in 2015 as Legal Worker of the Year for outstanding work in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. Law project that provides legal support to local black communities throughout the country as they demonstrate against police brutality and systemic racism. Humphreys has contributed to several anthologies, including Greening Africana Studies, The Brain Circulation, Beyond the Drain Gain Debate, and The New African Diaspora. And moving along, we also are really blessed today to have with us someone who has been in the movement for quite some time and who is a recognized champion going back to days where this kind of moment, the crucible of the mass incarceration conversation begins in Attica. And we are really lucky to have Joseph Jazz Hayden, the director. Sir, I guess everyone knows who that is. The only man up here except me right now. Yes, and yes. The director of the campaign to end the New Jim Crow, New York, which is focused on the solution side of the problem of mass incarceration and all of its progeny. A former Attica prisoner, he earned a bachelor's degree from SUNY New Paltz and a master's degree in professional studies from New York Theological Seminary while incarcerated. One of his most recent projects is the founding and running of Still Here Harlem Productions, a multimedia production company that aims to give voice to the people at the base of the social, economic, and political pyramid by developing a miniature CNN for the Harlem community. So I think that pretty much speaks for itself. Chuck D says, "See it, the hip-hop was the CNN of the hood." So if we have a miniature CNN for the Harlem community, I think we're in good hands. So, and last but not least, we have a new addition.
Introduce myself?
I'm going to have to ask you to introduce yourself, and maybe you would like to take the mic because I don't have your, we don't have your bio, but she
I'll
certainly
give you my bio.
highly recommended.
All right. I'm Risco Mention Lewis. I'm the Deputy Police Commissioner of Suffolk County, New York. I'm also a member of Law Enforcement Leaders. I don't know if you watched C-SPAN this last week, where law enforcement leaders, Charlie Beck, Gary McCartney of Chicago, Cy Vance, we all came out, about 130 of us are in this new group, to reduce incarceration and crime at the same time. Which is unheard of, right? Law enforcement leaders coming out to say we need to reduce incarceration. Here in Suffolk County, New York, I've also designed in Long Island an initiative called the Council of Thought and Action, which is an ex-offender support group, those formerly incarcerated. We have guys who have got master's degrees, who own businesses. As a Deputy Police Commissioner, as an Assistant DA I did it, and also as Deputy Police Commissioner we have around Long Island, and we have a few in Chicago. I think that's enough.
Can I just say one thing? Reverend Coverdale, who was supposed to be here tonight, is not well. You've come in and filled this role with less than 24 hours notice. So listen, many thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Excuse me, I didn't say one more thing.
Okay, well actually, can we wait till we get started? Because time-wise, we do need to
Now
move
you
along.
want to cut time.
If you can make it quick, would you like?
In his defense, he's only now in charge of time.
What I was going to say, in Suffolk County, we also have a number of initiatives, which hopefully we'll hear about later, which is bias-free policing training for our entire police departments and other things like that I hope we'll have an opportunity to speak to you about.
Yeah, and certainly don't want to give short shrift. We really appreciate you doing this and stepping in at the last moment. Well, everything happens for a reason, I suppose. So yeah, let's go. So just to review very quickly, just some sobering statistics, and we've heard much today in terms of facts, and we probably don't need to go much deeper into it. But actually, I think what we'll do is, we want to hear from our panelists. Our first question, essentially, and for the first one at least, we will hear from each panelist, and we may sort of, move around as we go. But if you could, talk to us a little bit about how you came to this work, what it means for you, what was your initial sort of, I guess, your opening statement, so to speak, describing for us what has been your experience in confronting carceral states. How do you come to this work then and now? And just keeping in mind some of the statistics that have been mentioned already, and I'll just review quickly. We imprison more people than any other country. I think we all are very clear on that, especially after today. The U.S. has over 2.4 million behind bars, an increase of over 500% in the past 30 years. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. You think about that for a moment. People of color represent 60% of people in these cages, we'd have to call them. 1 in 8 black men in their 20s are locked up on any given day. 75% of people in state prison for drug conviction are people of color, although blacks and whites see and use drugs at roughly the same rate. In New York State, here in New York State, 94% of those in prison for a drug offense are people of color, even though they're using at the same level. So we'll save some of these other ones for later, but with that being said, let's hear from our panelists. If you could, I guess we'll start with you, Joe, if you would.
Would you mind getting the slide of the slide presentation?
Yes, absolutely. Is it a touch? I got it. We got it. Okay.
Can you see it?
There's a slide presentation.
Did they drop the light somewhere?
I see if I can do that. Give it a shot.
I'm just going to go ahead and start. So folks, my profession is I'm a college instructor. And in 2004, I came up from Philly, where I was teaching at Temple, to New York City to attend the RNC convention. And I wanted to do more than just simply protest. And the National Lawyers Guild, which is one of our oldest civil liberty institutions, was offering opportunities to train folk in legal observing. And so what is a legal observer? A legal observer is someone who basically watches interactions between people who are exercising their First Amendment rights, demonstrators, right, in various ways of protest, including civil disobedience. And so I got trained as a legal observer in 2004, and I've been rolling the streets of New York City since then. So over a 10-year period, I've been one, if not the only black female, legal observer working for the New York chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. In 2014, or 15, I got a call that they needed a black LO, specifically a black LO, to come to Baltimore because of what was occurring during the arrest. The individuals who called me were saying that they looked and saw what happened in Ferguson, and that was when the Ferguson issue occurred. National law organizations, the NLG and the ACLU, progressive white organizations, and as well as attorneys and legal workers, rushed into Ferguson. And it overwhelmed the local community, who had little control over how these national law organizations and lawyers and legal workers from around the country, right, were going to participate in what was going on in Ferguson. And so in the context of Baltimore, they specifically wanted black folk, attorneys, legal workers, and LOs to be part of this legal team, right, and to be under the governance structure of a community group of organizations. So that's how I got into the work. What you're seeing is work that I've done across the country. Baltimore, I set up a rapid response legal hub where I trained over 300, 400 people to be legal observers in a matter of 3 days, to observe any kind of interactions between police, National Guard, and other security forces that are out there. I traveled to Cleveland. I then traveled to McKinney, Texas. I then traveled to Charleston, South Carolina, where I was legal observing across the country, as well as Los Angeles. So that's the kind of work that I've been doing for the past 10 years, and that we'll continue doing in terms of building this kind of infrastructure in black communities.
So thank you, Zeb. Thank you, Stony Brook. It's great to be here. It's also great to be having a conversation like this in Stony Brook and in this part of Long Island. I know Long Island has an interesting history with race, one that it should probably lean into and embrace, and hopefully conversations like this can help. As Zeb said, my name's Malia Lazu, and I first got started this work working for a leader of the civil rights movement, really, a man by the name of Harry Belafonte, who some of a certain age might know him. Others might know him as the dude that sings Deo. Others might know him still as the dude Jay-Z talked about on his last album. But Harry Belafonte was an incredible civil rights leader, bought Martin Luther King his home, his life insurance, all of that. And I was working for him in DC while at the Institute for Policy Studies and helped him start a group called the Gathering for Justice. And it was in those years as an activist that I was on the front lines, being sent out to Oakland as a responder to Oscar Grant, training 3,000, I guess what we would call at-risk youth in Kingian nonviolence, working with Bernard Lafayette, and helping helping people try to create legitimate economies. And after doing that work for almost 7 years, I was completely burnt out, which I think is a part of this conversation that also has to be included. How do we do this work in a sustainable way? I was so burnt out that I hid out at MIT for 2 years to just be in the most ivory of ivory towers and try to get as far away from it and really to think about it. And so in those 2 years, where I've started to now put my efforts is around building economies and helping neighborhoods transform themselves by utilizing the resources that they have. So I work with organizations like the Boston Workers Alliance, which is an organization that supports formerly incarcerated people, and we help them start businesses. We have an accelerator program. We've launched over 14 businesses so far. Everything from the first healthy food truck being brought to the food deserts of Boston to fashion design studios, and some of the companies have actually gone all the way to become fully funded and will go on to probably be sold. We don't really push VC, but the reason why I started focusing on that area, and I'll end here, is my work with Harry was amazing, but what it also showed me is that we're using a Dixie cup at this point to solve this problem. And what I realized is that so much of our protest, so much of our response to this does not in fact shift the conversation and does not recognize that this is a part of America's capitalism, that the lynching of black men is in the DNA of America's capitalism, that our own unconscious race bias that we each have here and that we have as being Americans is not really being addressed. And whether we end jails and then find another place to put the other, we will always find a place to put the other until we deconstruct the notion of other. So that's what I'm trying to do now, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
I have such a long history that trying to search my mind for what to bring to y'all in terms of why I'm here or how I got started in this. It's been weighing me out. But I think I'll tell you the first story. When I was 5 years old, and I was in kindergarten, I learned to read a book called See Spot Run. I'm sure some of y'all have read that book. And I wanted to take it home to read to my mother, because that's where I learned how to read. Before I came to school, was riding the buses and the trains up and down New York City, following my mother to work. She was a domestic servant, and she had to take me to work with her because she couldn't afford a babysitter. So I asked the teacher, could I take this book home to read to my mother? And she said, sure, but you'll have to wait till Friday. And I think that was on a Monday. So you know what it was for a 5-year-old to wait till Friday. Well, Friday came, and we were all lined up, getting ready to leave the class. And I looked up, and there was a substitute teacher at the door. So when I got to the door with my book under my arm, she asked me, where you going with that? I said, the teacher told me that I could take it home on Friday. She said, well, you're not going to take it home. You can't take it out of here, right? So I tried to walk by her, and she pushed me and snatched the book. At 5 years old, people were talking about I had been here before, because I was a small child, and I used to ask them, when they was leaving my house, make sure you drive safely, And anyhow, I went to the back of the room and found a flower pot and came back and flung it at this teacher's head. Okay, so they virtually arrested me and took me to the 32nd precinct in Harlem. Waiting for my mother to come pick me up. So I'm sitting on the sergeant's desk at 5 years old in the 32nd precinct in Harlem, and my legs are dangling over, and I'm waiting for my mother to come pick me up. Well, since then, I've had a strong dislike for abuse of power. And I think that was a catalytic event that changed my entire life and the way I looked at power, abuse of power. And I'm the same person as that little 5-year-old boy that was sitting on the sergeant's desk. That's who you're seeing here today. Okay? But now I've come through a life of probably every black person in here has someone in their family like me. I dropped out of every school I ever went to. I ended up with 4 college degrees and even went to Harvard on a scholarship. But that wasn't because of the system, that was in spite of the system. Right? So after my last stint in prison in 2000, I emerged and I filed a class action lawsuit challenging felon disenfranchisement in New York State. The name of the suit was Hayden versus Pataki. And ultimately, 10 judges sat in bank and they split 5-5 down the middle. So the lawsuit didn't go anywhere, okay? But during the course of this litigation, I traveled all over the country, spoke at all the major universities, and Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Rutgers, Columbia, NYU, you name it, I've been there. And at the time I was doing organizing around the issue of felon disenfranchisement, the right to vote for prisoners. And the funding ran out on that in 2008. And then I created another organization called Still Here, Harlem Productions. And if you go on my website, allthingsharlem.com, you'll see over 500 videos on YouTube that with me, I think virtually starting this stop videotaping of the police. And you'll see my interactions with the police force, the New York City Police Department, NYPD. And I think I inspired people all over the country to begin to police the police. I'll let you determine whether that is the case, when you go to my website on YouTube.
What's the website again?
Allthingsharlem.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, very good, thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Risco Mensch-Lewis, Deputy Police Commissioner of Suffolk County, New York. I would say I started my journey as my mom was a single parent. Actually, my father died when he was 30 and she was 27. She had 5 kids. I lived in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Grew up during busing. And I think I was asked recently what was my earliest memory. And it was my earliest memory was being we lived in the projects and they sent a bus for a bunch of kids. They're gonna take us to like a play area, like, Split Splash or something. And we were all lined up. Of course, my mother had us in like the second kids in the line, so we were gonna get on the bus, but they only sent one bus. And they had about 150 kids there. And they said, well, we can't take the rest of you, but you kids in the first 50, you can get on the bus. And my mother, we were second and third in line, and my mother said, no, you're gonna get on the bus here. And they said, well, you just won't be able to get on the bus, so we'll move the bus. And my mother's only about 5'3", and but she's tough as heck. And what she said was, she had all of us little kids surround the bus. And she said to us, if they try to move it, turn the MF'er over. Well, she actually said the word. And that was my earliest memory. And they bought 2 more buses there. And so what I learned at that age is, one, there were people trying to do good things, but you had to fight when things were unjust, right? But I also learned, when I was 10 or 11, I moved to Cape Cod, which is a very different environment. And so the rules I learned in Roxbury about fighting and violence, when I moved to Cape Cod on my first day of school and beat the kid up at the bus stop, I realized those rules didn't apply. And so what I've learned over the years is, in order to change the system, 2 things have to happen. One, we have to understand the system. So I decided to be a deputy police commissioner, assistant DA, a lawyer, to be a part of the system to change it from within. Because being in Cape Cod, I realized it wasn't that people wanted to hold people down. Half of them, or 90%, don't even know what's going on because of white privilege. They don't have any reason to know, right? A little bit different than nowadays. But the other thing is that people who need change don't even know how to change. And so, that's why I became a deputy assistant DA, working within the system to make sure the system was fairer, because I was trying cases, fairer when I was giving deals, making sure my cohort understood the life of the people that they were adjudicating, because there were, 5 assistant DAs and 250 people of color and 250 white ones. I think in Suffolk you have 2, maybe down to 1 now for ADAs, black ones, people of color. And so being inside of the system is another way of change. You can be outside of the system and change, but it's also important to have people inside of the system to change. Another thing that I've done as deputy police commissioner is getting the police department in Suffolk County, which is, I forget the numbers right now, but 78% Caucasian or better, getting them to understand the relationship between the police, the Caucasian police department and minority communities. Because once you're in leadership, you don't really know the relationship. You go to these meetings with 20 people, elderly women are there, and you think, oh, that's the relationship. But you don't realize the greater community doesn't necessarily trust you, doesn't feel comfortable with you, doesn't feel safe to you, and won't call you if they have a problem. And so getting a part of that is this training we're doing in the police department of procedural justice and police legitimacy, understanding that when you act in an unjust way, minority communities do not trust you and do not see you as legitimate. And getting police to understand that is a part of the work that we're doing in the police department. Having these meetings where we're doing, and so the idea, if you get it, is being inside, from within the system, educating the leadership of the system, of the paradigm, so they can understand first that the paradigm is intrinsically wrong and harmful. And 2, if you can't change the paradigm itself, getting them to change as much as they can within that paradigm, if this makes any sense to you. And so that's really the work I've been doing. The last thing I've been doing is working with those previously incarcerated to understand their rights, what they can achieve, that they are powerful, starting their own organizations, which is the Council of Thought and Action. If you go on Facebook, you'll see Council of Thought and Action, CODA, which is the ex-offending support group I run. We have it in Chicago. We have over 1,000 members. And they do voter registrations, they do all sorts of things. So that's basically it, is you can go outside of the system and fight outside the system, but you can also be a part of the system and fight from within. Because you really can't change a system that you don't fully understand, and you don't have the power to change from within also. You have to have people fighting from both sides. So.
Yes. Thank you, Jesse. I just wanted to say again, we found your bio. It's very long, by the way. too many accomplishments to mention, but we will post it up on the website and get that out to folks. We appreciate your time here today with us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I want to give Zeb a big shout out for having me on the panel. I am, I don't know if you can tell, the rookie out of everybody, but very much so glad to be here. I see a lot of the students on social media and on the internet. I really want to encourage you all to tweet out this discussion for everybody who's not here and should be here. My handle is @CF Coleman Jr. If you don't already have it, I'm sure you know Zeb's handle. And if you see something or you hear something that should be tweeted, send it out there so that we can keep this conversation going because it's an important one. My name is Charles Coleman Jr. and in terms of where my journey with this work began, I can say it started probably as early as I can remember being in front of the television, watching, and I don't even know if they show this every year anymore, PBS's Eyes on the Prize. And it was something that my mother, who grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, mandated that I watch every year. My sister and I, the whole week, we just watched it. And then when I was a little kid, at first I was like, man, why I gotta stay here and watch this? This is really not, like these people in black and white, I get it, so on and so forth. But I really didn't get it. And then as I got a little bit older, I watched Eyes on the Prize, and I got to the point that I looked forward to it. And these people became like heroes to me, like real life superheroes. And on social media, I sort of joke around and I refer to myself as a black superhero, but it's in homage to so many people who I looked at and read about, Parting the Waters and other like incredible books about the civil rights era that I really revered. And so I recall going to law school at Howard University, and one of my professors pulled me aside. I went to law school because I wanted to make money. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna come out and work for a large firm and get paid, and that's what I was gonna do. And I remember my first year torts teacher pulled me to the side and said, you are a trial attorney. You need to think about being a trial attorney. You need to think about being a prosecutor. And as a young black male, I was extremely uncomfortable with the idea of being associated or affiliated with law enforcement. And so I had to really wrestle with that. And I came out and I eventually began to work. My first job out of law school was as an assistant district attorney, so I'm glad I have some company here on the prosecutorial side in Brooklyn. And that was no joke, because at the time I was 24 years old and I was one of the youngest prosecutors in the history of the city of New York. And it was a challenge for me, because every time I would get a case, I would look at the age and the address of the defendant. And without fail, over and over and over again, I was seeing people who were born literally within days of my own birthday. And they lived like within like 3-block radiuses of where I lived. And so I started to ask myself, what was it that made me, that found me on one side of the aisle and found other people on the other side of the aisle? And I became really, not just fascinated, but enamored with this elusive concept of freedom and what freedom means. And the funny thing about freedom is that if you talk to different people at different points and you ask 10 different people what freedom means, you may very well get 10 different answers. If I was able to have the benefit to talk to my ancestors' ancestors and ask them what freedom meant for them, they might simply mean or answer that freedom is the ability to just be able to move around and not be in shackles, right? That was the extent, or that was likely the extent of their concept of freedom. And then if I talk to my parents, or even my parents' parents, their concept of freedom might be a little different. Like they might say to me, freedom is about access, the ability to access certain spaces. and the ability not just to be able to move freely, but to actually access these spaces and be able to step into them. And I think that's still something that is very elusive. And then, you know, if you ask me, my definition or my concept of what true freedom is the ability to create and fulfill your own narrative. For black men and women in this country, that is something that we struggle with. We watched Trayvon Martin go from being a 17-year-old, bright-eyed young man with his entire life ahead of him to someone who smoked weed, occasionally used foul language, was someone who got into fights. We watched that become his narrative. And we've seen over and over and over again how quickly our narratives are taken from us and they're redefined. Sadly enough, I'm just waiting for the report coming from South Carolina about this 15-year-old girl. I'm waiting for the report about her having smoked weed or gotten into fights or having had some bad disciplinary record, because that's what happens. That's what happens, is that our narratives become taken from us. And so this fascination with freedom and creating, the ability to create and support and fulfill our own narratives is really what has fueled my work. So after the DA's office, I became a civil rights attorney. And history has a way of teaching us that leadership in our community and leadership in terms of civil rights has come kind of sort of just in these huge, like, grandiose moments with one person at the forefront. Well, if you know history, you know that that's not true. And you know that there are many contributors that have been able to push and move the movement along. And what I tell people is that each and every one of us has something to give to pushing that conversation along and bending that arc further toward equality. And so my contribution after I left the DA's office was I started a nonprofit called EDGE Movement New York City. So EDGE is an acronym which stands for Empower, Develop, Grow, and Educate. And we work with particularly young men of color in Brooklyn, New York, from between the ages of 12 and 15. And we teach them a lot about life skills, civic responsibility, community service, and just ultimately how to create their own narratives and fulfill them. So that's my work, and that's how I got into it.
Thank you all so much. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's sons, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. That's Ella Baker. And we have been sort of talking about Black Lives Matter all day, tangentially, indirectly. Heather Thompson and others reminded us that the work that she said we wouldn't be here having this scholarly discussion if it wasn't for the movement in the streets that has created that opportunity. We want to get right into this. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. We've sort of been around the issue, and I want to start with Jill, who's worked directly, and others have as well in various ways worked directly with the Black Lives Matter movement as such. Much has been made of the Black Lives Matter movement of late. Some have debated its status as the 21st century civil rights movement. Are we premature in labeling it as such? What, in your opinion, has the movement done right so far? What has it done wrong? What, in your experience, should they be doing next? What are some of the similarities and differences between today's social protest movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the civil rights movement of the 1960s? What is different or new about the movement? What have been its strengths and what have been its weaknesses?
That's a lot. I want to start by saying that what do I think that the millennial youth movement is? I'm also going to say that I commend these young folk. I'm about 20 plus 30 years. They're senior. Okay, so I'm about, folks, I'm 50, right? And so I teach millennials, right? That's been sort of the work I've been, so let's get out of here. So I commend the young adults, the millennials, who I've gone back and forth with when I'm working with them in the classroom, that have basically stepped out and made their presence known, because I've been waiting, I've been a cell, waiting for them to make their presence known in this generation, right? And these young folk, or these young adults, are extremely intelligent, some of the most sophisticated, technologically savvy of our generation. And a segment of them, because it's a movement, so there are different sections within the movement, are connected and communicate intergenerationally. So I'm going to start off on a positive note. That segment of the movement that does continue the intergenerational dialogue, right, across the generations, I want to commend that segment of the movement and hope that the other sort of segment understands the significance and importance of intergenerational dialogue. I want to commend them on something else, that the folk who've come to the forefront are those who are considered throwaways, transgender folk, right, our young folk who are transgender, at least in New York. I'll say this to you when I'm out there providing legal support. We've got transgender black folk, we've got women, right, we've got folk who normally are invisible or thrown away, who are at the center, the core of this movement. So that for me, that is transformational for those of you who study sort of like the civil rights movement, where Bayard Rustin, right, was asked or told that he could not come forward because he was a black gay man. So I want to commend them for not being afraid to challenge the black community over our gender, right, or male-centric politics, and our sexuality and gender identity politics. In terms of the way in which they've organized themselves, which I think is commendable. Folks, we had rollout protests in New York City, because I swear to God, I think I was out almost 3 days a week LOing in the city, right? Whether they were doing a black brunch, for those of you who know that began in Oakland, where they were literally groups of protesters, right, would pick a restaurant where primarily white folk were enjoying themselves and walk in and say, you know, which side are you on? Right? These are just sort of, we're going to walk into an eating locale and just disrupt the day-to-day activities of folk who can exercise themselves, they're leisurely and not have to worry about this, right? And walk in and start their, which way you want to do a song, right? Ask people to join them. So that also started in New York. Commend them for the savviness of the ways in which they're disrupting people's day-to-day lives. The rollout protests, where they literally took over the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan. Let me rephrase it. Brooklyn Bridge, folks, there's a way you can walk over, and there's a way you can drive over. They're taking over the roadways, which means they are automatically engaging in what's been defined as an illegal act, placing their bodies in front of moving cars, and those of LOs who are joining right with them to do that, right? To make sure that we provide the legal support for them. If in fact, when they get arrested, we're able to get their information so we can track them through the system. Those types of acts of courage, or those are acts of courage for me, I'll just say that. You know, of course there are critiques, you know, that there's sort of this lack of demand on the system, right? They're disorganized, lack of demand. Folks, for those of you who studied history, you know that it's not like a linear, movements aren't just sort of like this linear way. You have different branches and different groups like who will engage in different ways. So I commend them for at least where they are taking these steps, and as they coalesce and move along, begin to make these demands, but also not get caught up in the system. Keep outside the system or challenging the system in different ways, because once you get caught up in it, for someone who's an academic, I can tell you it's very easy to get caught up in the academic trap, right, and not maintain your radicalness within the institution. So for those who are able to continue to think of new ways to organize, to link across struggles with other groups, which is extremely important, I think that they're also doing that, and to also make sure that our struggle here as black people has historically always been an international liberation struggle. For those who know about the blackness, it's always been international. So I commend them for linking up with the Palestinian struggle that's going on, right, and making trips. So I'm just going to stop there.
Yeah, and maybe we can, since that's the DA side of the table over there, and we want to also, I just wanted to say, Deputy Police Commissioner Mitch Lewis does have to leave a little early, so we want to make sure to give you your time, and maybe after.
So I think that a lot of what has been said about the Black Lives Matter movement is on point. I think people need to understand so Black Lives Matter is in fact a movement, but it's also an organization. And so I think that you have to, when you're having a conversation, you know, particularly whether it's praising them or even critiquing them, be careful about whether you're critiquing the movement versus the organization. So for example, one of the things that I think that the organization has done very well is that they've created space to have conversations. And that's really what protest is. Protest is fundamentally like space, it's space making. You are pushing back in order to create space to have certain conversations and to make certain changes that currently do not exist or currently have not been existing. They've done a really good job of that in terms of awareness because we all know what it is. We all know sort of what it means. We all have things that we associate with it. I think that where there is some room for growth is promoting the ask. There is an ask, but the ask comes from the organization. The agenda comes from the organization, and that's really been a knock on them. They've rolled that out. The biggest sort of source for that you can look up is Campaign Zero. I have some issues around Campaign Zero. I won't necessarily get into those right now, but I think that the problem is between the organization Black Lives Matter that has an ask and has an agenda, that's not automatically being communicated to everyone in the movement, right? And I think that that's troublesome. My biggest concern with Black Lives Matter is that I don't want to see Black Lives Matter evolve or devolve into another Occupy Wall Street. Because, for example, when Occupy Wall Street happened, there were a number of people who were out, they were promoting it, there was a lot of awareness that went on, and then in terms of what it could have been, it sort of dissolved. And I think that part of the reason why that happened was there wasn't a concrete ask that people were aware of, such that if you ask the average protester who was out there on Occupy Wall Street, okay, what is it that you want? What is it that you're looking for? That they had a direct answer. And I think that that's very much so the case with Black Lives Matter. As a movement, we have a tendency to say things like, well, we want justice. And that begs a larger question similar to the question that I asked about freedom, because in fairness, many of us in our community don't necessarily know what justice even looks like at this point. So Michael Dunn, for example, who killed Jordan Davis, Michael Dunn was sentenced to life in prison. Did we get justice in that case? Maybe we did, maybe we don't. But it doesn't, I don't think as a whole, make Black Lives Matter necessarily feel a lot better, because we know that there'll be another case. And in that case, someone may very well be acquitted. So I think part of the issue is that we don't have an ask, or rather the entire movement isn't aware of the ask. And if there's anything that I would say as a critique, I would like to see the ask that has been developed pushed further. I would really, in a perfect world, love to see Black Lives Matter evolve into the functional equivalent of the left's answer to the Tea Party, with specific demands, specific pressure. I know people are like, no, the Tea Party, wow, that's really radical. But in a sense, if you look at what Black Lives Matter advocates for on behalf of Black and brown people and equality and where we are, yeah, I guess it is radical, right? It is radical on the complete polar opposite end of the spectrum. So I think that there needs to be a way to formally engage the system while still remaining radical, but also in doing so in such a way where the ask is concrete and clear and achievable, and everybody sort of is pushing forward, asking for something simple.
Fascinating. Yeah, follow-up question. What's the ask? Yeah.
No, I want to address this question. Black Lives Matter is just like every other organization out there that thinks that demonstrations alone will solve the problem. Demonstrations bring attention to the problem. They don't solve the problem. The problem has to be solved in the political process. There's 41.7 million African Americans in this country, 54 million Latinos, there are Mexicans, Asians, progressive whites, which would, the population of this country is 3.8 million, 308 million. And with our numbers in this population, blacks, Latinos, and other minority groups, this is where the problem, it has to be solved. It has to be solved in the political process, man. We need to stop marching through the communities that are impacted by these injustices, and then we need to start organizing those communities. You know, going through them, talking about no justice, no peace, hands up, don't shoot, is part of the solution. It brings attention to the problem. But the problem can only be solved by organizing every black community and community of color that's being disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system of this country. We need to organize them, man. You know, organize them. It's time to stop talking about the problem, man. We need to talk about the solutions.
Absolutely.
Solutions, man. You know, not how bad we're doing or how bad the system operates, but we need to be talking about solutions. You know, and that's it.
Can I jump off? Can I jump off of that? No?
Will you defer to, she's good, okay. Roxbury's in the house.
Right.
Either way, so
Yeah, Roxbury.
I'm good with that. I grew up in Boston too, by the way. All right, please.
It's on my.
Yeah, talk to us about the solution.
Yeah, I just, you know, I don't want to critique such a, or even observe such a young organization and young movement. I definitely don't think if we're the first 15 years into the 21st century, we want to call it the civil rights movement for the 21st century, because I hope by, you know, 2080 we're fighting a different battle. But when I wanted to piggyback off of solutions, because I think that we have become almost obsessed by defining the problem. And the problem with that is that it keeps us in a victim mentality. And that's what I think we really have to shift. You know, how do we get, how do we actually find power? There's this really positive, or it's not positive, but this incredible paper written by a set of African academics called Necropolitics. And it's the politics of the walking dead. And it talks about people that lack determination over whether they can live or die. They talk about African Americans, they talk about Palestinians. But what's interesting in this, and I bring it up to, you know, to get at the solutions, is that we actually have to shift. I believe we actually have to shift the rhetoric. So if we're talking about having a nicer criminal justice system, we're not going to get there. And I think it's just really, really important that we look at the solutions that we normally find are very local. They're volunteer-based. You know, they're not angry, which I think, to my brother's point, would make me nervous. I mean, the Tea Party is an angry thing, and I don't think that that's how we want to move. And we also don't want Black Lives Matter to become the NAACP, right? We want them, we want them to be what they need to be for the time, and then we also have to be ready for the next thing to come too. Let's let things grow, let's things die. That's the cycle. And I think we so often want to institutionalize things, we want to centralize things, and that's actually not how movements work. And I'll end here by saying there's an amazing book that I think throws out an organizational theory for the 21st century. It's called Starfish and Spider. And the idea is that in the 20th century, we built spider organizations. They had heads. If you cut off their head, the body died. But what you want to do is you want to create a starfish. Because if you cut a starfish, you actually get two starfish. Because every starfish cell has like the starter DNA cells, right, to make a starfish. That's how you want to build movement. So if it gets cut, you now have two. You cut it again, you now have four. Now you're really screwed, right? And so when we look at solutions, when we look at you know, solutions that are working right now, they're local, they're decentralized, and they're volunteer-based. And I think it's really, really important to also shine light on those solutions as well as the institutions.
So I believe the topic was incarceration and race, right? And so how, I mean, let's, you know, I know we're talking, but for me, I just want to, I think I don't know, it seems like we're being very general versus very specific. And I guess that when you talk about solutions, those are the things we're talking about. What are the specific solutions, right? One of the things that I would say about the Black Lives Matter versus the Tea Party, wait, I want to start with the concept of a false narrative. right? And so one of the things happens as African Americans is we're taught a false narrative about ourselves. And we operate within that false narrative, so it makes sense that we stand outside of buildings and yell and scream and march, because we don't believe that we will be allowed inside the building. We don't believe, people of color don't believe in the system, so they don't utilize the system. But that's a mistake, because by doing both, the Tea Party works in the system, right? And they can get more done. So anyway, if you want to move something, yes, you can yell outside, because it brings attention to the problem. But you must also move from within, because the system itself is what moves it, right? From outside, you're not going to dismantle the system. You can bring attention to it. You have a lot of examples of that. But how do you work within the system as students, as individuals, as how do we work within the system too? Through voting, through organizing, through volunteerism. How do we do this moving the incarceration issue? How do we, for instance, in Torah Law School, how do we work with guys who are arrested, guys who have criminal records, right? And jobs are denying them opportunities. So that's the collateral damage of being incarcerated, right? How do we deal with what I'm dealing with right now is there's murder there's a murder in a neighborhood, right? And as opposed to saying we're just going to solve the murder like we might do in another neighborhood, we say we're going to arrest as many people as possible because somebody's got to know something. And so what that does is, what does that do? It raises the level of incarceration of African American males, right? Because we're trying to figure out what happened here, right? And why don't the African American males, why doesn't the community tell them? Because you're running around locking so many people up, nobody feels good about you, right? And so these false narratives, I believe, one of the things we have to do is talk about the false narratives that we are operating under in America. The false narrative of the violent black male, that the black male is the most dangerous species in America. We need to talk about that false narrative and dismantle the false narratives. Then once we talk about and dismantle those false narratives, we can dismantle the institutions that are set up based upon that false narrative. We can dismantle the prospect that all African Americans know in the neighborhood who committed that murder, they're just not telling. Versus you have heroin is the #1 killer on Long Island right now. It is the #1 killer. The people who die are white people your age, basically, to the tune of 98%, to the tune of nearly 300 a year, and 500 saves, right? But when we think about heroin, what do we think about? We think about treatment. They're on the news about treatment, right? We're not thinking about driving through the neighborhood and locking up heroin dealers, and we lock up enough of them, they'll tell us where the dealers are. We're not doing that in those neighborhoods. So we also have to talk about the false narratives that allow policing to be different from one neighborhood to another, right? So when we talk about solutions, these are the solutions we're talking about, right? But I'll slide and let that go now.
I just want to clarify, real quick.
Jill's acting.
Oh,
No, please.
okay, I just want to clarify, real quick, because I think some people may not have understood exactly what I was saying when I said that I would like to see Black Lives Matter evolve into the functional equivalent to the Tea Party on the left. The Deputy Commissioner hit the nail right on the head when she was talking about working within the system, right? Doing both. So awareness is one piece, right? But at the end of the day, right now, with respect to the two-party system that we exist in terms of elected officials at least, and people who are elected to represent our concerns, legislate, provide legislative solutions to some of the issues that we're addressing, everybody, for the most part, in terms of generally speaking, Democrats heralds Bill Clinton as one of the best presidents that we've seen. But if you know history, you know that much of the issue of mass incarceration is a result of policies that were instituted under Bill Clinton. Why do I bring that up? I bring that up because if we could rely on the current system or the current party system that exists to execute our agenda, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. So clearly there needs to emerge a faction, a group, individuals that are willing to step aside with a more focused and more targeted agenda and be willing to advance that within the norm, if you will, of political ranks. So when I say, to really expand the paradigm and push it forward, because...
Or bust it up.
Because what we're working with right now isn't getting it done. So the Tea Party felt like, we gotta, we don't like where things are going, and Republicans are not speaking to our needs. Well, my position is that neither Democrats nor Republicans are really speaking to the needs of our community. And so it is with that I say that Black Lives Matter does have a place in that conversation as a formal movement politically, running their own candidates, pushing their own agenda, and working within the system to really advocate for those things that matter to us.
I just want to say one
Yeah, that's a fabulous point. I just want, indeed, we have seen that the Black Lives Matter is in conversation with the Democratic Party. DeRay and Kinston and others are forming focus groups and what have you. Very interesting point. But we do want to,
Just one thing.
while you're still here.
I want to say one important thing is that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You know, that we don't throw out all of America. We don't throw out white people. We don't throw out white males. And, you know, we can't be so divisive, because you'd be surprised, even in the Suffolk County Police Department, how many people believe in changing the system, but not really knowing how, and not really understanding fully the impact of it. And so I think it's important that we not throw out the system too. I mean, that we look at the system, learn to work within the system, and understand that just because I'm doing something, it doesn't mean it's intentional. I think that's one thing I want to make clear. Just because we're doing things in America sometimes, it doesn't mean we're trying to lock up black males because we hate them. We have a false narrative about them, and now we're acting upon that false narrative. It's not necessarily bad people, it's just bad action. You know, just like
Or
so.
a bad system.
Pardon me?
Or bad, I mean, like,
Bad
or
system.
bad system.
Yes, I agree, a bad system, a bad, and so I just wanted to say that also in policing, we can't keep throwing police departments under the bus. Entire police departments, like, you know, we can't say, like sometimes in these marches, it's not the Black Lives Matter movement itself, but people within it saying, kill police. That's outrageous. It's outrageous to say kill people, or am I right or wrong? And so we have to also speak out the outrageousness of officers being killed. We have to speak out the outrageousness of the black males being killed too. We have to speak out the outrageousness of both sides, because justice means to give others their due, right? It doesn't mean we give this group their due and not this group. And so in our balance in this conversation, realizing that we have to be just to one another, and even the institution of the United States that exists already, such as the police department.
Yeah, that is a well taken point. We need to yield to.
Let me respond to this, man.
All right, have a good argument.
Let me respond to this. You know, we just, you know, we hear this all the time, that all policemen are not bad. Huh? How many times have you heard that? Anybody? I mean, raise your hand if you heard that. Huh? Okay. All policemen are not bad. The only not bad policemen are those that don't conspire through their silence. Silence is consent. Silence is consent. Silence is consent. Right? You know, so if we have 10 policemen, like the brother they choked out on Staten Island, you know, all those policemen that was around him, none of them said, man, back up.
Stop. Right.
Stop. Huh? Stop that,
He
man.
can't breathe.
Yeah, once he said he couldn't breathe, that was the end of that. You understand? For a good policeman. A good policeman would have stepped forward then and said, no, man, you can't do that. You understand what I'm talking about? So, if I haven't heard of any situations where police have come forward at the time that a person was being killed or abused and said, stop. My man, you can't do that. If you continue shooting at this guy, I'm going to blow you away. None. You know, so silence is consent. When we're talking about reforming the police, no, the only way the police have taken the relationship between master and servant and turned it upside down. They think that they are our masters. They think that they are our masters. On the police cars in New York City, they have inscribed courtesy, professionalism, and respect. I started filming them, and the first thing they say, man, back up, what you doing? And they want to challenge me for filming them. And I tell them, I say, man, listen, if you providing courtesy, professionalism, and respect, you ought to be glad I'm here. Because I'm going to witness this, man. You understand? I'm going to film it. And I'm going to put it up on YouTube, and Facebook, you know, and Twitter. But obviously, that didn't ring. Of course, the next thing I know, I was arrested. I was arrested for having a pocket knife the size of a toothpick and a baseball bat that they give out in every sports stadium in the country. And they kept me in the criminal justice system, in the court system, for 10 months while they tried to decide, and this is Cy Vance, a guy I helped get elected, a district attorney in New York City that I helped get elected. They kept me going back and forth to court for 10 months. 10 months. But they didn't realize what they had their hands on. Because every time I entered that courtroom, the courtroom was filled with supporters. And when they called my name, everybody stood up. You know, I'm Spartacus, I'm Spartacus. You know, yeah, I'm Jazz Hayden. And finally, when they went to get the knife, or they went to examine the evidence in the two district attorneys and my two lawyers went to examine the evidence, they tried to open the knife and it took them 5 minutes to get it open, and then it fell apart. The screw that held the blade to the casing fell apart. For 10 months, they had me going through this, man. 10 months. Yeah. Yeah, I was out on bail.
That struggle that you led.
But I'm trying to say, saying that
we live in a. Oh, go ahead. Silence is consent.
Silence is consent, man.
Yeah.
When that goes all the way up and down the line of the criminal justice system, that just doesn't stop at the policemen. You know, it stops at the district attorneys, the judges, the grand jury, you know, legal aid, all of them are involved in this conspiracy.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
My apologies. My apologies. Take care.
Thank you.
I just wanted to share with you very quickly in the context of New York, how the increased militarization of the police leads to the arrest of more people during protests, right? That leads them into the jails and prisons, right? Because that's the connection in terms of the work that I do. So folks, Dr. Birch is already, I think, is an expert looking at the way in which historically the militarization of the police occurs. But let me tell you how it operates on the street and the ground, right? So over the past 6 months, the city of New York has just passed or introduced something called the Strategic Response Group, or UNIT. This is a specially trained group of police that are designed to, well, first of all, they're equipped with paramilitary equipment, right? And they've been designed specifically to put down, at least what our commissioner said, to address issues of terrorism and protesters in the same sentence. He got pushback on that, right, in terms of connecting terrorists and protesters in the same sentence.
They seem much the same.
Right? But they're out on the street, right? So now what I have to deal with when I'm out there are specialized units that are trans. They literally have they're not under the command structure, the police structure. They cut across all boroughs, right? They supersede the commanders of the different boroughs. They use extremely aggressive tactics, right? So when I'm out there LOing, they in fact also push LOs, which is supposed to be a mechanism to hold police accountable, right? They also have long-range rifles, right? We're still having to deal with issues of the sound cannons, right? Long-range acoustic devices. This is something that, and they're exceptionally well-funded, right? So here's an actual policy change and shift in what's occurring out on the streets of New York. So I just want to share with you that, folks, that's what's going on. In terms of local solutions, in terms of how Black Lives Matter, the movement, made a demand on the progressive law associations that has literally put the National Lawyers Guild in paralysis, because we just had our national conference, right? The movement for Black Lives made a demand. They wanted the majority, if not all, of the legal support to be Black-led and provided. And that they did not want the NLG specifically to just be able to come into a site, set up their system and structure, and basically overwhelm the community and basically direct what's going on. And they, in fact, in the context of Baltimore, where I actually was working with the support team, told the local NLG Maryland chapter, no, you cannot participate. I'm just going to say this to you because you need to understand who the NLG is historically. It is one of the oldest civil liberty institutions. It is well-sourced, right? And the community organized themselves and told the guild, no, you cannot participate unless you abide by the governance structure, right, that we've set up. That's radical for a Black community in Baltimore, if you understand Baltimore's history, right, for them to be able to stop a major white progressive law organization. What I would say is that's the trend that's occurring across the country, which why I participated in becoming a founding member of the Black Legal Law Project, which is basically one of the first rapid, if not the first, rapid response legal teams, all Black team, that's literally being asked to go around the country by Black communities to help set up what's called mass defense infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure. If we're talking about systemic change, it has to be embedded within the community. That's the model. The conversation in the Guild over the past weekend is, and I wish our individual who just left was here, the conversation with the Guild was, it's an all-white organization that culturally does not know how to relate to even the Black people within their organization, let alone the communities that they want to support, right? They structurally are having difficulty with releasing the power and resources, right? Because they don't necessarily want to open up their informal networks with these communities, right? And have them on equal footing. Let's be real about what we're talking about in terms of shifting or changing the paradigm in the power relationships, right? So the work that I'm doing with the Guild, and those of us who are in the Guild, both in the Guild and outside the Guild, is trying to push the Guild, right, in terms of addressing some of these issues around implicit bias. It's not a false narrative, folks. We're talking about anti-Black racism, right? We're talking about bias and stereotypes. We're talking about stereotypes that evolved out of slavery, right, and post-slavery that we swim in, which is a cesspool, right? So that's the work, folks. And I just want to share with you that's what's going on at a local and national level. What I would share with if there are any folk in here from the Movement for Black Lives, you all are in a position of power. Call the National Law Organ Associations, ACLU, and NLG to the table. Now's the moment, it's a Kairos moment. Call them to the table and tell them, right, what you need from them and how that should be structured. Do it, because it's already happening in Baltimore.
Thank you. I think we're moving towards the end of things, but we don't want to, overlook that people may have questions in the audience, that there may be some folks who have questions, and so if you do, maybe get those ready. Let me just ask or put out one last thought, and we can maybe use this as a time to sort of finally sum up a little bit. The Center for Law and Justice has put out, speaking of solutions, we're at that point, we're talking about what can we do? What action steps can we take? What is one thing that everyone in this room can leave here tonight and actually do in their communities to make a difference in these things that we're hearing and learning about today? The Center for Law and Justice has put out a statement saying the following, quote, mass incarceration and the racist practices of the new Jim Crow, as manifested in all the collateral consequences imposed on individuals and communities, will be dismantled with a grassroots, bottom-up effort led by those most directly affected and supported by their allies. And I'm just thinking of Brother Joseph Hayden's comments of what we need to do in the way of solutions, considering allies, considering the fact that Latinos actually are one of the fastest growing groups we learned today in terms of mass incarceration. The numbers are worse for our brown brothers and sisters than they are for our Black brothers and sisters, and there needs to be, it seems to me, some kind of connection to be made around Black-brown issues and coalition building there. And yet here in Long Island, not everyone here is from Long Island, no one here is from Long Island, but there has been a lot of contentiousness here in the community between those very people, the old divide and conquer sort of technique of you know, well, these people were here first, or even the black people have had a hard time in Long Island. They've been here like a little longer than Latinos, and now they're having those kind of contentious moments. We can't go for that kind of thing. So how do we begin to lead that bottom-up effort that we're talking about, that grassroots effort? How do we make this manifest in our political work? What would victory look like from your standpoint? And what is at least one action step that everyone in this room can take to begin to dismantle the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration?
All right. Here I go again. Yeah. We have to come together. We have to connect the dots. Yeah. Right now, there's no vertical integration with the communities that are impacted. Like I've been in here all day today, you know, with the intellectuals, the historians, the people that have analyzed the entire system. They need to connect with the people on the ground. We have to have vertical integration. And all that knowledge and all that analysis and research that has been done at the top needs to be transmitted to the people on the ground. The people on the ground, we have to have horizontal interlink, right? You know, you got 5 people in the community, 5 organizations in our communities, they all dealing with the drug problem. But they ain't talking to one another. They talking to, the only ones they talking to is their grant writers.
That's right.
Huh?
And competing for dollars. Thinking they need to compete for dollars.
So there's no horizontal and there's no vertical integration. This is what we need. This is what we need. We need to connect the dots. We can't keep going back and forth like this, man, for another decade, another century. You know, everything is evolving. Well, I think we at that point now where we have to begin to stop thinking of ourselves as individuals. You know, ain't nothing more important than me. You know, that whole me mentality. What we need to do is to vote. The vote is the umbrella that we can all fit under. That's the one thing that we can all fit under. We are what they call we the people. This government is ours. And we surrender it simply because of our lack of action. Now, somebody was talking about the Tea Party earlier. You know, and they look negatively on the Tea Party. But we need to take a page out of their book. The Tea Party started out locally, school boards, community boards, and then they rose up to the House of Representatives, and when they got there, they shut the government down. Huh? And that was just a bunch of raggedy-ass human beings. Huh?
Let me ask a follow-up.
They did that.
Brother Hayden, let me ask you. No, in one concrete thing, some folks have been talking about, to Jill Humphrey's point, talked about this goes back to slavery. The 13th Amendment has the exception clause in it that states that is the loophole that is saying basically slavery is abolished except for people who have convicted a crime. It's still in the Constitution. Some people are calling for its removal. Where would you stand on that issue?
And we need to, I mean, the only time the United States makes concessions, you know, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they made that, man, when they were over in the war,
Vietnam.
In Vietnam, right? They couldn't afford this embarrassment being on the international level. You know, they were going over to Vietnam,
I got you.
you understand, to bring justice and democracy. But they didn't have it at home. In the civil rights movement, and the Black Power movement, and the things that were going on here domestically embarrassed them. So they made concessions. They gave us the Civil Rights Act. They gave us the Voting Rights Act. You know, in response to your question, which was what?
Well,
What's one thing someone can
the thing is, you said they gave us, but I would disagree with that. I mean, people fought for that 100 years after they gave it to us before, in 1865, okay?
Right.
So,
Nothing is permanent in this universe.
yeah, all
You know,
right.
change is the only constant in the cosmos.
Yeah.
You understand? So when we fight and win, that's not the end of it. You understand? There's always the pushback.
Yes, sir.
Pushback is going to come.
Yes.
Right now, they're talking about decarceration. And what happens? All of a sudden in the media, we're getting this uptick in violence, this uptick in violent crimes. You know, the police are being killed left and right. That's the pushback.
The fact is, sir, you changed the world. You and your compatriots in Attica, we live now in a world where people are talking about the new Jim Crow. They're talking of, it's not like, hey, lock them all up. People get it now. Like there's, the warehousing of black and Latino men and women, the factory towns that have closed down and been replaced with jails and prisons. And you changed that. Let's give Elvis Robin a applause.
Let me make my last comment about Attica. The Attica, the lesson that Attica, the most important thing that came out of Attica was the lesson that they had got rid of all the labels that disconnected us. You understand? The Weathermen, the Young Lords, the SDS, you understand, the Black Panthers, the BLS, BLA, all of these labels, we got rid of them. And we called ourselves the People's Party. And it was no longer the administration speaking in one voice, we was also speaking in one voice. And that was the difference. But that's the lesson that they haven't even learned out here yet. Huh? We don't speak in one voice. We speak in multiple tongues, man. Everybody, now it's Black Lives Matter. And, until we connect the dots, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen, man.
Speaking of multiple tongues, let's hear from some of our other panelists.
as someone who brought up the Tea Party, and I'm glad I did, because one of the things I really want to say is if we think about how we're thinking about the Tea Party, is that how we want people to think about Black Lives Matter? No, right? And that's what I meant by it, and I want to be clear. The Tea Party is disruptive. They're trying to dismantle democracy because of their white supremacist views. You know, it's just like I mentioned to Harry Belafonte once, I said, Goebbels was genius. And he was like, no he wasn't, he was a sick man, he could never be genius, right? Like, and I think it's important for us to look, like when I was in DC, I was a political consultant for several years. When I was 19, I started an organization called Mass Vote that raised the voter turnout in the city of Boston. By the time I graduated, it was a multi-million-dollar statewide organization. I understand the use of democracy, and I understand the use of voting. But what I think we have to be really, really careful of is understanding as you said, understanding the whole system. I don't know where voting now sits with the influence of money in politics. I don't know now where voting sits, right, with the influence of gerrymandering and redistricting. And I don't know if I want 10 members of a far left, and I'm on the board of Nation magazine. I'm pretty much as far left as you can get. And I don't know if I want 10 members. I'm like, you're like, no, you're like, please. Like, I remember someone told me the other day, they said, I remember when I shifted from Stalin to Trotsky. I was like, all right, dude, I can't touch you. But you know, this idea of that 10 loonies can shut down American government, I don't think is what we want to see the answer. I actually think, as a believer in nonviolence, as a believer in some of Dr. King's philosophies, that we want to get to reconciliation. I don't think that's what the Tea Party gets to, but to talk about my one solution, look at an organization called Simba Nation and Simsa Nation. They also work with an amazing organization called Barrios Unidos out of the Bay Area. They were also part of the gang truces in the 80s, bringing the Black and Latino gang pieces around. They do some of the best work. The Simba Nation actually has a 0 recidivism rate for any of their young men who come through their program. The founder is a gentleman by the name of Gaylord Thomas. He worked alongside Geronimo Pratt. Before Geronimo passed, he would bring him down to talk to the young people. Just solid work. And all of the young men that go through their program, if they've been arrested, they don't go back to jail, and if they haven't, they don't. So I think, again, there are some really powerful local organizations. And in the 21st century, communication has changed, right? A lot of things have changed, which means the minute communication changed, communities change. So being that that's so, then we have to look at how our community has changed. And we do need a Sankofa moment. We do need to reach back to some of the things in the past, but we need to bring those forward into the 21st century. And I think that that's what you could do today and tonight, is sit, reflect in your heart, what is it that you're willing to do to make a difference every day, and then commit to doing that. And if it's standing on the lines along Black Lives Matter, do that. If it's being part of the Dreamers, do that. If it's just making sure that if someone, in this college, if misogyny happens or sexism happens, which I know never happens in academic circles, that you stand up for it, right? It could be something that simple. So just, reflect with yourself, expand your heart, and see where that leads you. We need to think about solutions differently. So thank you.
Or it's just a response to your question about abolishing or changing the amendment, the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. I actually agree. I actually do believe we should, right? And I believe that the impetus is going to come from the ground. It's going to be people power. To be honest with you, yes, it can work with people on the inside, but if you do study history, people power, folk, revolutions have occurred. I'm just going to say it. God forbid I say Cuba. So I do believe that we have examples in our history, right, of people power. In terms of my relationship as an African American, as a Black person to the Latino community, folks, I'm originally from Los Angeles, different Latino composition, Mexican, Central American. I live in New York, right? So Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Afro-Latinos, right? So for me, when I look at the work in which Afro-Latinos are doing as being that bridge work, I think that there are some models that possibly could facilitate that work. Those of us who are bridgers. And so I'm just going to leave it there. There are other people who can speak more specifically to that type of work.
Thank you.
So I'm not an academic. I'm the least, I believe, academically credentialed, besides being an adjunct professor, panelist. Okay. I'm certainly, we're holding it down for the non-academics. But I do know this. I know that we cannot have a conversation about mass incarceration or any of the other institutions that are fueled by and supported by white supremacy until we begin to look at race differently and look at race comprehensively. Like, we can't think that we can attack one arm of the problem or fix that, and the rest of the system is just going to sort of flow and function naturally. That's not how it works. Racism is systemic. White supremacy is systemic. And until we invest, like really invest in addressing that, and cut off the power supply, if you will, to those institutions that are the result of that systemic problem, we're going to continue to have this issue. And so what does that mean? Well, we talked a lot about coalition building, and I think that I started off talking about not being an academic in a very purposeful way. And part of the reason for that is, like, as Brother Hayden already talked about, there is a failure to integrate vertically among folks who sort of like sit in a very ivory tower of thought and ideology about race, about many of the things that we discuss, versus the people on the ground who are directly impacted. And so there's a need to first and foremost bridge that gap, as Brother Hayden already talked about, right? But in addition to that, part of what gets disrupted in that process is that we have a tendency to alienate our teammates. And what we have to realize is that, like, you take your teammates, there's a saying in the law, you take your plaintiff as you find your plaintiff. Well, you take your teammates as you find your teammates. Your teammates may not necessarily, and I get nuance is a part of this conversation, and I understand the importance of languaging, and I understand all of that. But your teammates may not be exactly where you are when you find them. But remember that you weren't where you were when you started. And so there's an opportunity to bridge certain gaps as you take this journey together through coalition building, as you attack this sort of like multi-headed monster of racism and white supremacy. The other piece that I would sort of urge is that while you're doing your part, the pressure has to stay on those of us who are on the team that have privilege and that are in certain spaces. Because when you're truly invested in combating that multi-headed monster, that means that you're being willing to leverage your privilege to the advantage of those people who don't have it, to the advantage of people who maybe don't have access to those spaces. So to conclude, Zeb, what I would say the win looks like, I'd start where I started, which is, if you ask me, the win is freedom. And whatever that means for each and every one of us, that's the win. And freedom to define exactly what that picture is, rather than someone who has oppressed you turning around and then telling you, now you're free because I have decided it is so. Versus you being able to declare, I am free, to have that as your reality, and to truly embrace it, live it, and bring it into fruition.
Last word. No, all I want to ask is, are we all human beings?
Yeah.
Yes.
Are we all human beings? Because this racist narrative, man, was created at a specific time by a specific group of people that benefited from racism. And we keep using this narrative for our discussions about change. When I looked out at Black Lives Matter, their demonstrations, and I saw more white kids out there than I saw black. And they were talking about Black Lives Matter. And they were laying down on the ground. I don't know what their grandparents and their parents were thinking when they looked on TV and saw their kids out there. But we are moving in the direction of a non-racial direction, man. And that's what we need to do. We need to jump this racist narrative, man. It ain't about blacks, browns, whites, yellows. We are all human beings. We are all human beings, man. No other species does this, treats others in their species like this here. Put them in cages, man. Human beings in cages. We've risen to the top of the food chain. We eat everything below us. Everything that lives and breathes on this planet, we eat it. If birds are on the ground and a human being comes around, they fly off. Squirrels, they run up a tree. We're the most dangerous people on this planet, man. But we can't come together you know, we create this color differentiation, you know, black, brown, white. No, we all human beings, man. And we have to get away from that racist narrative if we're gonna win.
That's a very good point, considering the fact that at the beginning of the 20th century, there were certain groups that were not considered white that are considered white today. Just a caution to add to that, there are folks whose skin may be black and brown who will be conferred what scholars call honorary whiteness in the 21st century. So they're still playing that game, and you're absolutely right, we can't fall for that narrative anymore. And so I really do appreciate you mentioning that. I want to give all of our panelists a round of applause and thank them for their comments and for their stories and examples and parables and all kinds of things that we heard tonight. Metaphors and similes were used, and I think we covered all bases, and we have been educated and fed tonight, I think, thoroughly, and we thank you all very much for that. Are there any questions before we go? Last chance, or we can certainly, we are pretty much at time, and our panelists are here for a few more minutes. I believe it's a reception, and hopefully questions can be addressed one-on-one. So thank you once again.
Turn on the heat.
The rent is too high. All right, thank you very much.
Really, I just want to say from the Center for Study of Working Class Life, what we're trying to do in the Center for Study of Working Class Life is to bring class into focus in its operations to shape people's lives and experiences here in the United States, which can't be done without understanding the intersection of class with race and with gender, and the operation of class in the United States with its operation worldwide, its global economic system we're in. Now, the way that we are trying to do this and why we sponsored and co-sponsored this study, this conference, and this session in particular, is because we want to encourage people to ground their scholarship in the lived experience of class. And we want the practitioners and the people who are in the field to do more than tell war stories, but to really think about what those war stories and what that war is, and how do we understand what lessons there are in those interactions in the world that help us to understand how class works, and how class works in its intersection with race and gender. So the thing that's so important to us in the center, and I think to the organizers of this conference about this session, in this conference, is that we are trying to integrate theory and practice, walk on those two legs of intellectual work, but also grounded experience in really trying to change the world. And I think we have a panel here that can talk on both of those aspects, in both of those levels. And that's what we're looking forward to, and that's what our work is, and that's what we would encourage everybody sitting in the room to do with their work and with their lives, whether it's in the field or whether it's in the research library or in the classroom. And that's my wish for the day, and we'll just keep on with the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Everybody hear me? That's right. I want to give another round of applause for the opening remarks and for all the different departments and offices that are supportive of this endeavor. So many things to say. First of all, I want to give a shout out to my students who are here and who have obviously filled up the room. And all the students and other folks who have made it here for this event. I'm sure we have more than just Africana. We also have history students. We have everyone here. My name is Dr. Zebulon Valetsky. I am an assistant professor of Africana Studies, and more recently added to the history department as well as an affiliate member, which I'm exceedingly proud of. Although Gary told me that not everyone has signed yet the form, so.
I haven't signed yet.
So I hope this goes well, you know. I'm going to have to sing for my supper on this one, but...
Full of fiends, friends dying, why we crying? Was a Zoomy yesterday, power in their very sound. Laughter and wild crying. They fight and keep trying. We used to know we were stronger than the devil. But teeth were all eat you. Eat us. Whip whirl hide under your feet, biting on top and underneath. Crazy, stomping, gurglers whirl. Could catch up, Malcolm. Could trap Lumumba. Could dive down and beat Biko. Could lie and use stink from his very ass to kill Teray and Kuma. Could bite inside yellow pages, hunting for unemployed maniacs, Sabeco. Could speak Portuguese, send poison fleas, Cabral. Could white out mouth, sneak in as dressed up nothing, king. Could yesterday themselves and afterwards the OOs of hyena ghosts crawling out of Dunsats. As the furniture polish of Watergate killers' mouth could be wasted by the insanity of mistakes. Stalin could be lied about, ignored, misused like diarrhea, clouding the world to a hole's toilet linen. Could be studied to death in dust, swept clean on Mark Ingalls. Loyal opposition bedbugs, right, Mayakovsky? Could be olded by the torture of escaped assassination attempts. You know we should have killed you. You should have stayed with Fidel or the Chinese, Rob Williams. Where's your Negro gun now? The Ku Klux Klan in the White House, Dr. Du Bois, and Garvey didn't send him there. Rabin dead in his own Jewish state. Some of his own folks did the hate, Yitzhak. Why this whole ugly we have to eat or beat or flee or don't see or just claim we know its name or be happy but insane. Was we always drugged and dead, Huey? Was we always fat and full of shit, oh elephant? Was we always crouched midget Booker T's, hoping they could intermarry silence in the 20th century? Was we always nostalgic
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the story. Really, I just want to say from the Center for Study of Working Class Life, what we're trying to do in the Center for Study of Working Class Life is to bring class into focus in its operations to shape people's lives and experiences here in the United States, which can't be done without understanding the intersection of class with race and with gender, and the operation of class in the United States with its operation worldwide, its global economic system we're in. Now, the way that we are trying to do this and why we sponsored and co-sponsored this study, this conference, and this session in particular, is because we want to encourage people to ground their scholarship in the lived experience of class. And we want the practitioners and the people who are in the field to do more than tell war stories, but to really think about what those war stories and what that war is, and how do we understand what lessons there are in those interactions in the world that help us to understand how class works, and how class works in its intersection with race and gender.